Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Monday and welcome back to Norse Studies Week 8. Today we are going to dive into Section 5 from the Heathen Handbook by Woden's Folk Kindred. This will be about the Vanir gods. Now, the Vanir are a separate tribe of gods from the Aesir. There was a history of both of them being at odds with each other for a variety of conflicts over an extended period of time. But eventually a peace was struck and the two tribes began to merge together. And this was done through an exchange of hostages to help ensure that both sides would exhibit good behavior. This kind of arrangement is something that is often seen in pagan mythos as well as throughout human history. I mean, after a conflict, whether we're talking about between humans or gods, people in general like to have an insurance policy just in case the opposition gets up to something. And that's what that was. Now, the Vanir have a different worldview from the Aesir gods. They possess different powers, they have different priorities, they have a different kind of wisdom. And this allows them to become a natural counterbalance to the Aesir. Now, the authors began with an overview of these differences and what the Vanir gods are like as opposed to the Aesir. But they do begin by acknowledging that our basic knowledge of the Vanir is limited, to say the least. As per usual, nothing new there. And of course, most of what we know about Vanic gods comes from the stories of the Vanir who came to stay with the Aesir as hostages. But of course, it stands to reason that there would be more members of the Vanir tribes than just the few that we are aware of. Details are sparse, and the only members of the Vanir that we know anything about are Njord, Freyr and Freya from Scandinavian sources, and Nerthus, who we have knowledge of from continental Germanic tribes. Snorri definitely didn't do us any favors in writing about the Vanir. There are masses of contradictions in his writings. I'm not saying that the authors of the book were pulling out their hair, but I suspect they felt tempted. And some of Snorri's writing was done with the intent of justifying the legitimacy of the Yngling dynasty that ruled over Norway and Sweden at the time. So a lot of the details got bent and, kind of shuffled around. And I mean, we always have to consider the source. Now, the Vanic worldview incorporates the idea of there being a divine pair, that every deity has a mate of the opposite sex who naturally balances their power, and frequently these pairs are also brother and sister, if not actual twins. So we have Njord and Nerthus, and we have Freyr and Freya. There's also an emphasis in the natural seasons and their impact upon farming and herding, with a particular focus on the ramifications of keeping livestock, the ebb and the flow of that. Humans and animals were seen as being in a kind of partnership, each sustaining each other. And of course, that holds true today, even if we are a bit further removed from the process. One of the differences between the Aesir and Vanir can be seen in how each tribe achieves prosperity. The Aesir do this through hard work, just very straightforward. I'm going to do this task and this task will result in this outcome, and that's how they become prosperous. But for the Vanir, it was much more likely they would achieve prosperity through magic, and this would include the magical energies of sex. Now, these approaches towards success are complementary rather than contradictory, and if we can learn how to use both approaches in our own lives, it can yield great benefits, and it can make us overall more successful in general. At this point, the authors began discussing the Vanic gods themselves, and they began with Njord, who is considered to be the father of the Vanir tribe, as well as being a deity of merchants and the sea. He is known to be someone who bestows wealth. In addition to Njord's strong associations with prosperity, he was also a deity who valued order, and he can be seen as a sacral king. The authors define a sacral king as a ruler whose state of being is reflected by the condition of the land, the sea, and the people. He's also a kind of a conduit between the people and the gods. It is an office of the in-between. Njord is also linked with the taking of oaths. In Icelandic heathen laws, anyone who needed to conduct legal business at the gathering known as the Thing would have to swear on a holy ring and say, "So help me Freyr, Njord, and the all-powerful God." And in this context, the all-powerful God being referenced was Thor. It's interesting that oath-making and oath-keeping involved two of the Vanic gods, but only one of the Aesir. But moving on, Njord's home is called Noatun, which means shipyard, and he is believed to control the wind on the sea and the yield of fishing. In addition to all of his other roles, Njord is a warrior. He has been described in the Lord as the breaker of Odin's gates. that would be quite a thing. Clearly, he was a force to be reckoned with in battle. And as previously mentioned, Njord was a part of the hostage exchange after hostilities between the Aesir and the Vanir ceased. And if that wasn't enough, he also had to step up to the plate and be the means of providing compensation towards Skadi after the death of her father, Thjazi, who was a giant. The Aesir owed essentially a blood debt, and that was accomplished through giving a marriage to one of them, and by that time, Njord was considered to be one of them, and so he was married off to Skadi. Much of Njord's worship in times past did occur in coastal areas. It would make sense for heathens and pagans who live along the coast to revive his worship there. And if nothing else, if we are wanting to connect with this deity, to make offerings to Njord in watering areas, it just seems like an intuitive thing to do. Next, we come to Nerthus, whose name we only know thanks to Tacitus. Tacitus wrote of three primary divisions of Germanic tribes. We have the Hermenenes of the German interior, the Ingvegones by the sea, and the Istevans, who made up essentially the rest of the area. It was the Ingvegons who were known to have a cult of Nerthus. Now, Ing, as a prefix, means meadow or pasture, which of course points to the Vanir gods. Now, last week I mentioned that the authors discussed the theory of Victor Rydberg, who believed that Nerthus is actually Frigga. This would mean that she was originally Njord's wife before being married to Odin. And if this is indeed the case, that raises the question in my mind if her marriage to Odin was part of the peace settlement, but also intended to be kind of a humiliation for Njord and to remind him of what his new place was going to be in the current order of things. If this is true, it would also mean that Frigga is the mother of Freyr and Freya. And there has been some suggestion by scholars that Njord and Frigga's brother Uther are one and the same. Now, the tribe called the Langobards were devoted to Frigga, and it was Tacitus who declared that the Langobards were the most devoted to Nerthus. So, all of these connections, is it proof positive? Perhaps not, but it is difficult to ignore the reasoning that does link Nerthus and Frigga together. The authors also postulate that if Nerthus and Frigga are the same goddess, that they think it would also be possible that Frigga is also Jord, which translates as the earth and therefore the mother of Thor. Personally, I have difficulty going that far. For a start, Njord was known to be a giant, and we know that the giants, aka the Jotun, are another tribe of gods that are separate from the Aesir and the Vanir. It also strikes me as a desire to simplify the gods family tree, and that it just goes a step too far and it's connecting dots that aren't meant to connect. However, I am a lot more sympathetic and open-minded to the idea that Nerthus may be Frigga, so I'm just going to let this simmer in the back of my brain. As time goes on, I may have further thoughts on the subject. We'll have to see. Next up is Freyr, son of Nerthus and Njord, brother and first husband of Freya. He is also called, I'm going to botch these, you just have to bear with me, Veraldar God, meaning God of the world, and Asa Yodar, defender of the gods. The authors liken Freyr to Balder and describe him as being blameless and a giver of peace to gods and men. I take these descriptions with a teensy tiny bit of grain of salt. Personally, I do find a little bit more to admire about Freyr than I do Balder. For further elaboration on that point, go to my YouTube channel and check out my playlist on the god Balder. The lore is more plentiful when it comes to Freyr in comparison with the rest of the Vanir. Saxo tells us that the Temple of Uppsala was strongly linked to Freyr, and we know of the various sacrifices that took place there. He is viewed as being the lord of the Josalfalheim, I think that's how it is, land of the light elves, and by logical extension this would make him lord of the elves who reside there. There have been royal houses in Scandinavia who trace their ancestry to Freyr, underscoring both their divine right to rule, but also their connection to the land and to Freyr himself being rooted in the very soil of that land and the blood of its people. The boar is strongly associated with Freyr. He had a boar called Gullenburst, meaning golden bristled, who was able to transport Freyr throughout all of the worlds, just as Sleipnir can go through all of the worlds. Boars are incredibly intelligent, and they are very bold defenders of territory, and I think this makes them a very suitable emblems of kings, because essentially that's what a king is supposed to do. Freyr eventually married the giantess Gerd, and their story speaks to the relationship between the sun nurturing growth upon the earth, as well as the agricultural cycle more generally. It's possible that Gerd's mother was Arothuba, who is also known as Agraboda, which would essentially make Loki Freyr's father-in-law. Just kind of interesting if we if we're going to take it that way. It's also an unfortunate fact that during the course of arranging the marriage to Gerd, Freyr eventually had to surrender his sword that could actually fight on its own and was meant to save them all at Ragnarok. He had to surrender that to his servant for services rendered. And that, of course, rendered Freyr weaponless during Ragnarok to tragic consequence. So, maybe he should have thought about how he was going about arranging that marriage. Maybe tried something else. The authors at this point also mentioned the theory that some people hold that Freyr is essentially the Norse variant of Kronos. The idea stems from both deities often being pictured with antlers or horns, being associated with shamanic work, and of course their ties to animals and the practice of hunting. Personally, I'm not completely convinced of that idea, but this is one of those things I'm keeping an open mind about. And last but not least, we shall discuss Freya, daughter of Njord and Nerth, sister and first wife of Freyr. She is also called Vanadis, meaning goddess of the Vanir or divine lady. She's also called Vanabruther, meaning bride of the Vanir, and Geffen, meaning giver. She was a priestess, a practitioner, and teacher of magic, specifically of Seether, and is foremost amongst the goddesses. She claims half of the battle slain for herself in the realm of Folkvanger. Now, we can't mention Freya without discussing her sexual nature. Her appetite was and is voracious, and she is frequently the object of desire of gods and men. However, the author strongly recommended looking at Freya's sexual capacity in the more metaphorical sense, just as we view the strongest traits of other gods in the context of metaphor. Freya inspires desire, and she exemplifies the pursuit of desire. That, of course, involves striving for what you want, overcoming obstacles, being relentless, keeping focused. And in this way, we might see Freya as much as a goddess of ambition as she is a goddess of love, sexuality, and fertility. Freya did come to be married to the god Odd, and there are lively debates among scholars and heathens about whether or not Odd and Odin are actually one and the same. And if they are, that would be pretty icky, considering that Frigga is Freya's mother. If she is indeed, I mean, he's married to both mother and daughter, which is just icky. But we also have the debate of are Frigga and Freya one and the same? And that leads to even more of a tangle, and I don't think I'm prepared to get into that without getting a little bit of Tylenol. Now, the argument that Odd and Odin are the same stems mostly from the similarity of their names. About one point that the authors brought up that I haven't seen other sources bring up is that it is strange that Snorri did not present them as being one and the same, because Snorri did go out of his way to link any and everything that he possibly could to Odin. And if Snorri's contemporaries had considered Odd and Odin to be the same being, it seems like a peculiar detail to omit. So the authors put forth their idea that Odd and Odin are separate beings. But again, this is another one of those controversial things. Back to Freya, she has a pronounced war aspect, and in the lore there are warriors who have a very high regard for Freya. The fact that there was at least a 50-50 chance of Freya claiming them after death in battle might explain that kind of veneration. Freya is associated with the sow, just as her brother Freyr is associated with boars. Now, sows are known to be absolutely vicious and relentless when protecting their litters, particularly when they're under threat. And this indicates that Freya's warlike aspect is more so about protecting hearth and home, protecting your people, and going into a frenzy if that's what's needed to do. It's not someone who would be a warrior by profession, but rather someone who became a warrior out of necessity and met that challenge. Last but not at all least, the lore is forever attesting to the fact that one giant or another is trying to claim Freya for their own. Now, one of the possible reasons why Freya might have been so sought after, in addition to, of course, to her beauty and her own sexual nature, is that all of her abilities were centered on the idea of striving and achieving things. That's why her loss for the Asir Vanir combined tribe would have been so devastating, and that their own power would have been diminished because they would have lost essentially one of the energetic dynamos that helped keep everything in motion. So that does it for the book section. But before I end this video, I wanted to make mention of a recent Freya Norling video. It was titled, I'm going to kill your Halloween, or some words to that effect. I'll try to remember to link it in the description. But in this video, she offered a different perspective of what the thinning of the veil means. Now, if I understood her correctly, Freya doesn't really regard there as being a veil between this world and the next world at all. She believes that the difference in atmosphere at this time of year isn't a thinning of some veil, but it is a thinning of nature as everything goes to sleep or dies off. We may perceive the energies of the unseen more strongly because there's less competing energy in the material world. And I have found this to be a really